The bookshelves of Riordan Mansion are still filled with thousands of books belonging to the family. Karen Washabau, a docent here at Riordan Mansion, has spent years browsing these bookshelves. She's here today to give us a glimpse behind the covers of some of the Riordan's well-worn books. Welcome, Karen.
Well, it is great to be with you today. And what a better time to talk about books than October, which is National Book Month. So this is the month when the National Book Awards are announced and people get all inspired about encouraging reading. Well, I'm guessing you like books, and that's one of the reasons you're watching this today. I'd like you to think about a couple of things. If I were to come to your house today and walk around and look at your books, the books that are in your shelves or on your coffee table or on your bedside table, what would those books tell me about you, about your interests and your passions, hobbies maybe? Here's a second thing to think about. If we took those books and put them in a time capsule to be opened 100 years from now, what would those folks think in 2122 when they opened that time capsule? What would your books tell them about the life we all are living today, the things we're interested in, news, new inventions, and so forth? Well, that's what we're going to do for the next few minutes with the Riordan bookshelves. We're going to see what they tell us well over 100 years after a lot of these books were published about the times in which the Riordans lived. So I hope people have had a chance to tour this magnificent house built in 1904 by the Riordan brothers, Tim and Mike Riordan. But you know, long before this house was built, the Riordans were already having an impact on literacy in Flagstaff. And here's a picture of the brothers, older brother Matt, and then Tim and Mike Riordan. Tim and Mike, of course, were the ones who built and lived in the mansion. But Mike Riordan was actually the president of the Flagstaff Library in 1890, well before the mansion was built. So his love of books and his knowledge of the importance of books was already being felt in the community. Older brother Matt, who also lived in Flagstaff, donated 600 of his own books to help the library get started. So the Riordans' connection to books and libraries goes back a long way. Well, I'm sure if you've toured the mansion, you've seen the bookshelves. They are built in, they are everywhere, and they are loaded with books. When I was a tour guide for Riordan Mansion, I always got questions about the books, like Shannon said, and I didn't know much. And people would say, well, what are these books about? And I'd go and read a couple titles to them, but that wasn't enough for me. So finally, I asked if I could browse the bookshelves and actually take some books out and look at them. And the park manager said I could, but I had to meet two conditions. Number one, I had to wear museum grade white cotton gloves every time I touched a book. And secondly, when I was done with my review, I had to tell a story. Well, this is the story that I'm telling today. Here's a quick overview of the book collection. The Riordans donated over 4,000 books, but it wasn't just books. That 4,000 includes magazines, maps, pamphlets, copies of articles. And so it's a pretty vast collection. About half of it is religious, a quarter is fiction, and a quarter is nonfiction. The oldest book that we've been able to find was copyrighted in 1863. It's a prayer book, a Catholic prayer book used during the Civil War. The most recent books were from the 1950s, and they're primarily novels of that time. Well, my focus is on nonfiction because I think nonfiction will give us the best sense of the times the Riordans lived in and what some of their hobbies and other interests were. So what I did with the nonfiction books was I took 300 down from the shelf. Some of them I looked at, some of them I just leafed through, but I picked 75 out to skim or read, and then I have 20 that I want to share with you today. But before I leave this overview, I did want to say something about the religious books. Riordans were very religious, Catholic, strong Catholics. Their religious books were extensive. They had so many Bibles, prayer books, encyclopedias, history of the Catholic Church, history of popes, all the works of Cardinal Newman. So they had very extensive religious library here. Their fiction books comprised all of the popular authors and some of the classic authors of the day. Just read you a few names of books: Jane Eyre, Silas Marner, Sherlock Holmes, the Canterbury Tales, all the plays of Shakespeare. They had short stories by Poe, short stories by O. Henry, but then they had some more modern books too, like The Sun Also Rises and Main Street. They liked biography. They have a biography of Charles Dickens, which I actually did read through, and then an autobiography by Henry Ford. And that would have been a real hot piece of literature in those days because Ford was just getting well known with his automobiles. Well, let's dig into some books. But before we do, I want to give you my 30-second synopsis of the Riordan Library, nonfiction library. And there we go. They were interested in a wide array of topics. You mention a topic, think of a topic, they had a book on it. They always were looking for ways to improve. So their books are self-help and improvement books for their families, themselves, their businesses, and the community here. They left a lot of personal clues in the book. They left notes, marginal notes, little checks and X's and colored pencil notes, occasionally a clipping from the newspaper or a picture. And they were very mindful of the historical value of books. I think for me, one of the most important pieces of knowledge I received was that this period of time from about 1895 till about 1920 was such a cutting edge period. So many trends were just getting rooted that we have lived with throughout the 1900s and into the 2000s. So those are some of the things that I hope you'll pick up as we go through here. And I just need to, I'm getting, the very first book I took from the shelves happened to be the oldest. This is a book that was published in 1874. It was self-published by a man in Iowa named Charles Kinsley. It had many editions. This book was reprinted, I don't know how many times, but it was called The Circle of Useful Knowledge for Farmers, Mechanics, and Merchants. Its price was $2, and it was super popular. Now, the book consisted of a lot of charts, and I'll show you a couple of those, one of those actually. But before I do that, I want to read the author's self-endorsement here. He says, "This system contains hundreds of valuable suggestions for all types of human effort, procured from the most reliable sources, many of which have cost the author quite a sum to publish. No family should be without this book." A great piece of PR. Well, here's what the book consists of: pages of tables. Anything that had a number attached to it, you could find a table for in the book, in the Circle of Useful Knowledge. This one example is a table of daily savings at compound interest. So if you look at number 11 there in the far left-hand column and go over, you can see that if you save 11 cents a day, by the time you get to the right-hand column, in 49 years, you will have $11,600. Lots of tables like that to inspire people to save, to figure out how much they'll make per month if they take a job that pays a certain amount per year. So these tables were really useful. But it also had a lot of frequently asked questions, what we call facts today. Just some of them that caught my eye were how to make cough syrup, make your own hair dye, poultices. If you had a broken bone and you wanted to set it, make a poultice at home. Also how to manage a farm, how to write up a receipt or draft a release, write up a lease for someone. And then one of my favorites, how to be your own doctor. So many things to learn from this circle of useful knowledge. There was one question in the book that had a big black X beside it. And I think maybe Tim Riordan made that X. I'm not positive, but this was the question: how can I rid my house of cockroaches? And the helpful answer is, Use a half a pound of borax scattered across the floor. And borax is also a good dentifrice and is great for cleaning the scalp. So there you go. You ask one question and you get tips on 3 different uses of borax. Now, when I looked at that book, I couldn't help but think that we still want to know answers to all those questions today. This is probably a forerunner of something that we are using every day. Yes, Google. So the circle of useful knowledge has really morphed over time into something that's just an everyday part of our lives. Well, the Riordans subscribed to a lot of books about travel and leisure. They loved to travel, took many trips themselves, probably took I think they took 3 trips around the world, traveled to maybe 30, 40 countries. So they were really into travel and travel in the Southwest and in the US. And in their leisure time, they liked outdoor activities. So a lot of what we see will be books with those subject areas. I want to start with these magazines that were very popular at the time. The Riordans subscribed to a lot of magazines and journals. Because of the increase of literacy among Americans and the cheaper cost of printing, this was really a boom time for magazines. In 1850, there were about 600 magazines in the US, which still seems like a lot to me. But by 1900, there were 5,000 magazine titles that were being circulated in the US. Well, here are the three that I browsed. Century, on the left-hand side, was a monthly that serialized novels, and a lot of these novels had to do with the outdoors. Well, the one in this particular issue of Century was Jack London's Sea Wolf in its serialized state. Outdoor Life was a monthly magazine, and the article in this particular issue of Outdoor Life was titled Moose Hunting with a Camera. Now, that is the sort of title you'd see today in magazines when we're looking to travel and hunt without harming the environment or harming animals. Moose Hunting with a Camera. It also had some short stories in it that featured outdoor life, and it's still being published today, even though it's digitized now. Out West. Well, Out West magazine was a monthly with articles on travel, events, and lifestyle in the West. And travel to the West and Southwest was skyrocketing at this time because of the railroads, because more people were moving into the middle class and maybe had a little more money to spend on things like travel. So the Riordans loved to travel. They liked outdoor activities. So it's no wonder they subscribed to this magazine. Here's an ad from that magazine, a great promotional piece on Flagstaff. You can see it's touted as the Sunlight City, sunshine, pure air, mountain spring water, and then a number of natural attractions are listed. And at the bottom, you can see who sponsored this ad. Babbitt Brothers, Arizona Lumber and Timber, which was the Riordan's company. So all the big companies in town were getting behind this advertisement. The article in this issue was about the reading room in Winslow, Arizona. Big companies were starting to set up reading rooms for their employees to go to in their spare time. You can see in this reading room in Winslow, you have newspaper rack over on the left, and everybody's sitting around reading or reading a book maybe. You could also borrow books if you wanted to. So this is just an example of the thrust that businesses were making to have literacy be a key component of their training. And then a couple of regular ads, your standard old ads in Out West magazine. These look like 2 ads that you would maybe see in some variation in most magazines. The $1,500 a year for life one is about investing in rubber plantations. And the printing is very small, but I picked out one section that really appealed to me, rubber plantations. If you invest $25 a month for 7 years, you will get $1,500 for life. Now, I don't know, I couldn't quite figure out how that was computed. It's not in the article, but that does sound like a great come on for someone. The Cadillac ad What it says is, advertises the Cadillac Runabout. It touts it as the only machine found to stand the strain of leaping the gap. And you can see a runabout leaping the gap there. It's kind of a forerunner of the advertisements we see today for cars that are going down switchbacks or going over very bumpy rocks and so forth. This one was leaping the gap. Here's another travel book that the Riordans had, and one that was very dear to their hearts because of, obviously the Grand Canyon was close. It was a gift to Tim from the author, Dr. John Van Dyke, who was an art history professor. And he had spent a lot of time at the canyon doing research on its history, geology, and archaeology. So he wrote this book, and then he invited a bunch of prominent people in the area to join him on a guided tour of the canyon. And apparently it was a very highly rated guided tour. At the end, all members were given a copy of this book. The book contains a number of black and white photos of the canyon. Here's one of the Bright Angel Trail, the upper part of the trail. If you look closely, you can see on the left top corner, you can see the roof of El Tovar. And by the way, Tim Riordan wrote in the book near this picture, my brother, Michael Riordan, named El Tovar. And that's true. Mike came up with the name for the hotel. The next picture is of the title page in the book. And it's got two different sets of handwriting here. The top is where the author, John Van Dyke, sends it to Tim Riordan. But then in the bottom is handwriting from Tim himself. And he wrote this after he had been on the hike with Dr. Van Dyke. Let me read you just a part of this. Tim says, Dr. Van Dyke rode with us partway to Grandview today and told us the way to get the best color effects at Desert View was to lie on the ground with your left ear down and look at the desert. And the effect I found was marvelous. So then Tim says, I did the same thing on the right ear, looking out and across the canyon with wonderful effect. So that's kind of an interesting way to be looking at the canyon. And I haven't actually done that myself, but I certainly would like to give it a try. Let's turn now to natural resources. I've grouped the rest of the books I'm going to talk about into some categories that seem to make sense. The Riordans owned Arizona lumber and timber, so it's not surprising that they knew the importance of healthy forests. And so they were always looking for ways to improve. Like I said, self-improvement and improving your business was very important. So they had a lot of books on trees and forests. Here is a 2-volume primer of forestry written by Gifford Pinchot, the gentleman you see right there, who became the first director of the Forest Service, the US Forest Service. He wrote these books on anatomy. That was part 1. Part 2 was forest management. And forest management was kind of a new approach to forestry in the United States. Pinchot was very popular because of this. And he also knew the Riordans pretty well. In fact, he wanted to establish experimental stations to promote forest health around the country. And the Riordan brothers convinced him to set the first one up in the forest north of Flagstaff. And you know the experimental station up there. Today, it's a National Historic Landmark. One of the photos, and pictures were really popular now in these books. One of the photos in this book was kind of a delightful picture of folks lounging on a fallen sequoia log. The point of the picture was the big scar that you see down the middle, which was caused by lightning. And that was one of the points that Pinchot wanted to make apparent to people, how trees can get injured by lightning. Well, another book that has some prominence in their library in the natural resource area was Climatic Cycles and Tree Growth. This was a book written by A.E. Douglas, and that name has certain connections here in Flagstaff. He was trained as an astronomer, and for a while he did work at Lowell Observatory with Percival Lowell. But then he became more and more interested in the correlation between tree rings and sunspot cycles. So after quite a bit of research, he became what he has acknowledged as the first dendrochronologist in America. Well, he had corresponded with the Riordans and had spent a lot of time in northern Arizona, walking around in the forests and learning about the forest world. So he sends this book to Riordan with my best regards and grateful remembrances of your early help in this work. And some of his pictures are of forests in northern Arizona. The top picture is what he calls the bottomless pit near Flagstaff. And the bottom is a grove of ponderosa pines. He calls it the yellow pine forest of northern Arizona. In the book was tucked a postcard. This postcard was from a friend of Tim's. The guy had sent it to Tim from Russia, where he was studying forests of Russia. So Tim writes in the back of this postcard that he just received this book. But what I love is what he writes at the bottom of the postcard. In his own words, he says, lumber is made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. His own variation on the Joyce Kilmer poem, Trees. Well, something very important happened in 1908. And when I saw this book on the shelf, it looked like a very contemporary book. It was not very thick. It was pretty tall and thin, nicely bound. Nice, simple title, Conservation. And that wasn't a phrase I had heard much in those times. Well, our friend, former buddy Gifford Pinchot, seen here on the right, thought it was important for the White House, Teddy Roosevelt was in the White House at that time, to sponsor a real important conference on conservation. So in 1908, Roosevelt, with the help of Pinchot and a lot of other people, sponsored the first White House conference on conservation. The key conference findings were that the United States continue conservation programs for water, land, and forests, which had been getting started in a very slow way at the time, but that we'd be more aggressive and develop conservation programs for minerals. They estimated at this conference that we had about 50 years of petroleum left, about 100 years of coal, and 100 years of iron. So one of the important items on the to-do list to come out of this conference was to develop ways to conserve those minerals. This was a very highly attended conference. There were 360 people invited, state, local, federal people, lobbyists. They were all men. But Teddy Roosevelt, probably in an acknowledgement of the importance of women in this issue, invited a woman to join the conference. And she happened to be the president of the National Federation of Women's Clubs. So from everything I learned, she took quite an active role in this conference. So conservation today, very common term. We hear it all the time. But back in the early 1900s, this was a new thing. Well, I found the next book. Let's see here. Yeah, I found the next series of books on business management, mostly on Tim Riordan's side of the house. Everybody wanted to make their business more effective. And in the early 1900s, this notion of being a manager and a business manager was just coming into vogue. In fact, in 1900, Harvard Business School was started and Wharton Business School were started. So now we had a focus on business management that was more than just keeping the facts and figures of your business in your head, which is what had happened with a lot of the small companies and small businesses that were around before this. You couldn't keep all the facts and figures in your head. Now you had to know the number of employees you had, how many debts outstanding you had. And so that's where business management came on the scene. Well, this was the journal that the Riordans got at their home. It was called System, the Pilot of Office and Factory. It was a pretty substantial magazine, really, a journal that came monthly at 20 cents a copy, $2 a year. And it was loaded with ideas now for all of these companies that were getting bigger to organize and run in a more professional way. So there was a huge deluge of books and journals on business management at this time. But this journal, this particular issue of the journal, was focusing on how you can make your salesmen better. And sales, in fact, direct door-to-door sales were a big part of a lot of these companies. So here we have an ad for the System, for this magazine, and all the little components of an organization are listed there on their the little desks that are being held by the great hand. And it says in this little ad, when man has a grasp of his business, that's the way to go. It says System, perfect automatic system, keeps him in touch with every department all the time. He doesn't have to, quote, butt in or, quote, stir things up or rave or rant to get excited to keep things running smoothly. Well, you can decide for yourself how that has worked, but over the years, that certainly has been the focus of a lot of organizations. If you have all these systems now, you have offices for manufacturing, for credit, for sales. You've got offices everywhere and paperwork everywhere. So now you've got to figure out how to organize this stuff. A lot of office equipment was invented in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And there you see 6. I have 6 listed for you here. So which one do you think it was? I thought when I took this little quiz that it was going to be the swivel desk chair that allowed you to just swivel around and do all sorts of things at one time. Here's a hint. It revolutionized office work in the early 1900s the way that computers did decades later. So the guy who invented this next invention is sometimes referred to as the Bill Gates of the early 1900s. It was the vertical filing system. It was believed to have been the answer to so many paperwork and organizational problems. The guy who invented this was working at his dad's insurance company, which was just overrun with paper. And what they did at that time was they'd fold up a piece of paper and put it in pigeonholes, which I'm sure you've seen the old pigeonhole style of filing. And Edward Sybils, the guy that invented this, thought, that's just not efficient and it's time consuming and it's just not working out. So he invented the vertical filing system. He applied for a patent, but he hadn't made a mock-up of the system. He had just done a drawing of it. He didn't actually have a file cabinet set up, so he was denied a patent. But boy, we have vertical filing systems and lateral filing systems in all of our offices today. I mean, right now I'm sitting in front of a couple. So it's too bad that Mr. Sybils didn't get to benefit from that. So the Riordans had many, many books on management because they had a lot to manage. But let's take a break and go to something I call grammar management, if I can get it to stay there. Grammar management came about when I was browsing the shelves of the mansion. I came upon this red book, and it was nestled between 2 kind of nondescript books, The Story of Foods and Nursery Ethics. Well, I looked at this red book. It said English study and English writing. It was a grammar book. I didn't want to read a grammar book. I'd say grammar hasn't changed all that much. But one of the rangers said, you need to take a look at that book. So I pulled it out and I saw of interest a hole through the front of the book. I was told that that hole was made by a bullet. Well, as I browsed the book, I saw the bullet go through the first part of the pages. And if you look at the top, you can see the book was owned by Richard White Riordan, who was one of the sons of Michael and Elizabeth Riordan. And as everybody does in a textbook, he scratched a lot of stuff on that front page. It was his textbook in September of 22. And sure enough, the whole continues the whole way through the book. Well, now, how did that bullet hole get there is a question we can't answer definitively, but I have a few theories of my own. First theory is, I think maybe Richard was coming home from school one day, had his books clasped to his chest, and a stray bullet from somewhere on the street came at him, and instead of hurting him, it pierced the book. So he was saved by his grammar book. The second theory is that he hated that grammar class so much that when it was over, he took the book, shot at it, and obliterated it, or hoped to obliterate it. But you never know what you're going to find when you open a book at the Riordans. Wellness, manners, and domesticity is a big category of books here at the mansion. And I think while the men, the Riordan men and their colleagues were improving business organization and trying to systemize the way businesses were conducted, the Riordan women were looking to see how they could improve homemaking and family life, which at the time was their primary responsibility. Now, wellness, manners, and domesticity books were wildly popular in the early 1900s. Here's Elizabeth Alice, her sister Alice Metz, and Caroline Riordan, who probably browsed a few of the books I'm going to show you now, because they were, just like their husbands, trying to be on the cutting edge of what was going on. The first book I'd like to show you has kind of a clunky title, What Must I Do to Get Well, and How Can I Keep So? But it was a highly popular book. In fact, it was sold 32, there were 32 different editions, and it was sold well into the 1900s. This book was written in 1889 by Elma Stewart. You see Miss Stewart here. And on her cover page, the title page of the book, she doesn't even put her own name as the author, but she says, she repeats the title, What Must I Do to Get Well, and How Can I Keep So? And then she says, by one who has done it. So this was her book about the Salisbury treatment that had, she said, saved her life or cured her of an ailment she had for 8 years. So she was so enthusiastic about it that she wrote this book. The Salisbury diet is what the whole book is about. Salisbury diet was developed by a doctor who was in the Civil War named James Salisbury. Here's a picture of Mr. Salisbury. He was concerned that his soldiers were experiencing a lot of gastrointestinal problems. So he tried different diets with them to see if he could find one that was more comfortable for them. He tried diets of all grain diets, all bean diets. And finally, after also doing different diets with 1,000 pigs that he bought and studying them, he came up with a diet that he felt was the best. And this is the diet that helped Elma Stewart get well. You eat minced beef only, and you eat it 3 times a day. You cook it a little bit. You're not eating it raw, but a grown man can eat 1 pound of beef at each of those meals. So he's eating 3 pounds of beef a day. Supposed to omit all other foods. Salisbury believed fruits and vegetables were damaging to your system. Also grains and brown bread, omit all of that. And then while you're eating, or after you've eaten your minced beef, you are to sip 4 pints of hot water daily while you're lying down. And if you do this for a few days, you will be actually purging your body of bad things and of all the bad food you ate before, and you should feel a lot better. Well, you know, it became popular and people used it for a long time. And here in Flagstaff, a noted citizen, Mrs. Charles Babbitt, had her own recipe for minced beef. She called it frizzled beef, and she worked up her beef just the same way Salisbury did, but she added some interesting things to it: rich sweet cream, and then a piece of butter, as she says, the size of an egg. So you cook all that up, and while it's still rare, put a little cracker dust in it and serve it immediately. So, frizzled beef, the Salisbury diet have been with us for a long time and are still with us because we still enjoy Salisbury steak, and companies that are well known for their frozen food entrees to this day offer an entree of Salisbury steak. So talk about a legacy. James Salisbury's legacy lives. Well, here's a book I grabbed off the shelf right away. It's called Old Age Deferred by Arnold Lorand. And I don't know if you feel like I do, but I wanted a deferral. So I read through this book quickly and totally and came up with a few thoughts of my own. Lorand was a Swiss doctor. He worked in Switzerland as a doctor, and he was alarmed by the condition of a lot of people and a lot of older people. So he thought, this is what I can do. I can write a book to give people tips on how to stay young. The Riordans got a Christmas gift of this book from a friend of theirs, and the friend writes this endorsement in his letter to the Riordans. I understand this book is the most authoritative book to date on the subject. It's a sensation in Europe, translated in many languages. So, I mean, Alfred Lorand could just take those words and put them on a pamphlet as an advertising and promotional piece. So the book was extremely popular. But Lorand presents a caveat in the preface to the book. He says, whoever thinks they can be transformed into a sprightly adolescent will be disappointed. But we need no longer grow old at 50 or 40 or 50. What I love about the Riordans is they would clip stuff from newspapers or get a picture or a postcard from someone and stick it in the appropriate book. Well, Tim Riordan had a bunch of articles stuck in an envelope in this book, in Lorand's book, about aging and long-lived people. So here's one of my favorites. The world's oldest man, age 134, dies in Kentucky. Well, this is a short article about Uncle Johnny Shell. Johnny Shell was married to his first wife for 85 years. His second wife that he married after the first one died at age 30. He had more than 200 descendants. His oldest daughter was age 90, and his youngest child, a son, was only age 6. So Uncle Johnny Shell had quite a family. I love the end of the article. It says, Shell was a typical Kentucky mountaineer. In his younger days, he was involved in several feuds and was never worsted. He was never beaten. Up to the last few days of his life, he was a crack shot with a rifle. So no wonder Tim Riordan wanted to save that article. It was really inspiring. And there are pencil marks and check marks throughout the book. Well, Lorand left readers with a list of 12 commandments for the preservation of youth. And some of them make a lot of sense today, and we observe them today. For example, he said, drink more water, eat a balanced diet of fruits, veggies, and brown bread. I think he and Salisbury would have gotten into a little bit of a debate over fruits and veggies or not, but Lorand insisted that fruits and veggies made for a healthy lifestyle. Also, avoid tobacco and limit alcohol. Well, that's what we hear today. But there were some unusual ones too. Avoid cycling, running, and crossing your legs. So that was one of his tips. Avoid mental work for 1 hour before and 1 hour after meals. That would certainly put a crimp in the workday if you had to abstain from any mental work for 2 extra hours. And then finally, he said, you need to spend time in the open air. And he had this lovely endorsement of open air living. He said, when in the country, we should always prefer mountains, and the higher they are, the purer is the air. High mountains with pine and fir trees generally have fresh air full of oxygen, and there is no drug in a pharmacy that can equal these beneficial effects. So here we are, we live in Flagstaff in the mountains with pine trees. I'd say we're all on track to live long, healthy lives. Well, Americans were aspiring to get into the middle class. They were aspiring to get to the upper crust. So one thing they had to do was learn better behavior. And in the late 1800s, very early 1900s, you had a host of etiquette books that the Riordans bought. And I would say used, because there are a number of markings in these books. Let's look at this book on the right, Frost's American Etiquette. That book was published in 1869, and the author, Annie Frost, this was written by a woman, Annie Frost, set out behavior for any kind of a situation, how to act at a wedding, a funeral, a picnic, a dinner, a going away party. And she also gave tips on letters, how to write a love letter, how to write a breakup letter, how to write a thank you letter. So it was really a great compendium of laws of good society. It was very popular. Then along came The Bachelor and the Chafing Dish, the Aqua book over here. Chafing dishes had been around for a long time. And in fact, the first book on the bestseller list, on the first bestseller list, was about chafing dishes of all things. Chafing dishes were viewed as an implement that would civilize people. And in this book, it was used to show bachelors how they could entertain more effectively if they used chafing dishes. Good Form for Men, in the back there, was the first serious book for young men to learn about ways to groom themselves and also behave better. So these books and others like them that were in the Riordan Library came way before Emily Post. Emily Post didn't publish her etiquette book until 1922. I would bet you, knowing a little bit about Emily, that she was going into a lot of these older books and taking tips and using them in her book. And the Emily Post approach now is an industry in itself. Well, most home libraries have a cookbook, and this was one of the Riordans. In fact, they had two copies of this book. I guess this one was pretty beat up, so maybe they got a second one. This was Principles of Domestic Science. And in the title, you can see that people were trying to systematize or lend scientific principles to homemaking tasks. And that's what this book did. It had a lot of great tips for how to more efficiently do housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, laundry, decorating, entertaining. The best part of the book, though, was recipes. And there were a lot of them in here. So I was looking through the recipes and I wanted to see which ones did Caroline Riordan probably use. It wasn't too hard to figure it out. Oops, first we were looking at, this is one of the great tips from this book, how to tell if your eggs are fresh. Put them in a glass of water. If they're fresh, they're going to sink. If they're a little bit old, they're going to start tipping. And then if they're really old, they come up right through the water. Many women raised chickens and had eggs to make a little bit of extra money. And so this was a way you could gauge whether the eggs were fresh. There was no egg council to do that for you. Now here we go to Caroline's recipes. I would say she loved these recipes because you can see little splatters of dough and food on these pages. So we also know she was a great baker and her baked goods were always excellent. So that was my forensic look into Caroline Riordan's cookbook. Well, I'd like to close with a book that is kind of nondescript. I didn't know what it was. It's the book of the Jonathan Club. The Jonathan Club was a very high class men's club in Los Angeles. And Tim Riordan was invited to join the Jonathan Club. So he did. And this book has the rules and regulations and policies of the Jonathan Club. So it was in their library. But the most interesting thing to me in this book is what Tim writes on the inside page. He says, and he writes this in 1911, save this book for historic use in the future, in 2011 and 2111 and thereafter. So Tim, if you were here, I would say, we did it. We saved this book and all of your books and the mansion well beyond 2011, and we are determined that they're going to be here in 2111 and thereafter. But the Riordans had a real good sense of the historic importance of books. Well, if we're talking about time capsules at the beginning, I think the Riordan Mansion and its furniture and its books and its clothes are a great time capsule that we've been left. And I really think Tim and his family would have been delighted to know that to this day, their name comes up constantly in Flagstaff and elsewhere. In fact, one of our Flagstaff businesses, Mother Road Brewery, brewed a beer, created a label for this beer that featured the Riordan Mansion on the can. Here we have a picture of it outside the mansion. And Mother Road determined that it would dedicate part of its proceeds to reconstruct this stone archway that you see in the picture, which is in the front of the mansion. So it's part of Mother Road's ongoing work to give back to the community that they are so proud of. Well, I was lucky enough to get a can of this beer. I hope you can see it. Actually, the can's not open. I won't be opening it yet, but I wanted to make a toast at the end here. I would like to do this in honor of the Riordans and all they've done for this community. And with special thanks to the Riordan staff and all the volunteers who keep this place alive for us. And a thanks to you for staying with me and learning about this wonderful place that we call Riordan Mansion. So here's my toast. May your pockets be heavy, may your heart be light, and may good luck pursue you each morning and night. Thank you.